Good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Eventually, I'd like to be able to say good morning, but we gotta, hit some different time zones in different areas and continents of the world for that to be a true statement. It feels like it's been a long time since we've done one of these, partially because it's been the longest gap between the last one that we've ever done. But with the 4th of July being something, me having my first fourth as an American, kind of a big deal. So it was really nice to have that little break, and I hope everyone has recharged and recovered from whatever festivity-based debauchery you've engaged in, and we're ready to get back on track with health. So we're clipping these along. We're at the environmental portion of the fitness factor examination. And this one's really cool because I will hypothesize that the content that's going to be covered in today's lecture is something that gets, I don't want to say glossed over, but its weight of importance is typically less of a priority than obviously the thing that the person has come in for. We as clinicians hyperfixate on wanting to cure the thing, rid the person of the thing, reverse engineer the reason why the thing's there, and never let the thing come back again. I said things way too many times in a few statements there. But fundamentally, what really I find has a massive impact on the person, besides a well formulated supplement plan and the appropriate, say, dietary strategies, is what they're doing with their time the rest of the 168 hours of their week. Because you come to realize that, the efficacy of any protocol is really supercharged by the supporting processes. What I mean by supporting processes is the environment that the person lives in. Things we've talked about in past webinars, like the emotional states. Things of that nature have a synergistic effect to allow the potential for success outcome to be much greater. And I think the lowest hanging fruit in all of it is optimizing the person's environment in both contexts, which I'll get into from the inside and the outside, and harmonizing them as they come together, because you realize where the person spends their most time is a huge opportunity, because theoretically everything they do or they experience in that environment can be pushing them in the direction of ultimate health, which is likely their goal. Or in the case of something like, mold toxin exposure, based upon being in an environment that's harboring mold, can actually be one of the things that's preventing them from getting better, or even actually contributing to the major cause of illness in the first place. So environment is something that I think should a lot more emphasis should be placed upon, because it's almost like, we just throw these at the end of a protocol. Oh yeah, eat this way and filter your water and do this and do that. But we have to understand the nature and the complexity of environment, how it comes together. So the classic definition of environment is the surroundings or condition in which a person, animal, or plant lives or operates. Well, that's obviously very obvious, but it's really how that environment affects us as individuals or us as populations or communities, because fundamentally, the environment of which we live in is what underpins our existence. And when we talk about the components of environment, we can talk about the external environment, which houses us, the planet with all of its main elements, air, water, earth, fire, things of that nature. But then there's the crossover to the human-made components of the environment that have become a mainstay in what we expect is, our normal life. We live in houses. Houses are part of subdivisions and communities. Our nature scene oftentimes are the parks we take our children to. There's infrastructure and aspects of industry that add things to the non-man-made environments that change the scope of that environment. And then if we look more at a human environment, there's us as the individual that can evolve to a family, a community. And those aspects can actually be, especially in the year 2023, depending on how you look at certain things with, religion or education, politics, economics, they can be something that can be very hazardous to our health if they engage us in some sort of, stress response in battle. Because fundamentally, what we're trying to do as humans is trying to adhere to the basic fundamental code in all of us, is to find safety and the ability to survive in an environment, which is also going to reflect in how our bodies are going to be able to sustain themselves and ultimately express their degree of physiology from a health or a disease-based perspective in said environment. So our genetics, our physical tissues and how they were designed were probably most aligned with this period of time in human history. We call this the Paleolithic, the hunter-gatherer time period. And at this point, we didn't rely upon agriculture. Mobility was used as a strategy. What that means is, we were chronically on the move either to find food to find a more suitable dwelling, or to perform the necessary work that sustained our ability to survive. And the whole thing was really about a cooperative. We needed the community in order for us as an individual to feel safe, to feel nurtured, and obviously to thrive and stay healthy. Everyone had their specific roles, and it was very much an interdependent system. And the ability to relate with the land was a very important thing because, as you'll find out, when a human relates with the land and we do things like ground, we drink clean water, we breathe clean air, that adds an effect to our body's experience of what it can allow itself to achieve when it comes to health. And this was not more than 100,000 to 200,000 years ago. So the thing that's really interesting is, from a genetic perspective, we are not so different from our hunter-gatherer forefathers, but this is what we've evolved to from a technology perspective. And I think a huge disconnect in what's going on with the modern epidemic of human disease that we see on the planet across all cultures is that our genetics have not moved nearly as much as our ability to relate with technology. So the more technology is developed, the more it has actually taken us away from that which our personal bodies were designed to deal with. So if the previous slide was the Paleolithic hunter-gatherer, we'll call this the modern, survivor city dweller, because I think oftentimes in the city center, survival is what the body's really trying to do. And this person, rather than relying upon movement and hunting and gathering, relies on conventional agriculture. And we know that that's usually the path of things like fast food or convenience food. And when it comes to mobility, I mean, since COVID, you don't even need to leave your house to work, let alone put on anything other than pajama pants. So mobility is either when you want to go out to the store, maybe when you want to jump on the subway, or you go for a drive from here to there. And this modern lifestyle, doesn't require large access to land. So most people can survive within a city block because it provides them everything that they need. And think about this, there's never a lack of available food. And if this environment is mostly man-made, we're not moving much. We have a chronic energy toxicity problem, but we're taking in calories and not getting in enough nutrients. So the environment that we were designed to relate with has evolved so quickly. So maybe the concept of modern disease is an interference pattern or a lack of ability to resonate with our external environments because it's pushed itself too quickly out of balance. And when did this really all happen? Well, it was really at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. And why the Industrial Revolution was so powerful in terms of its impact and influence is it has ushered in the creation of more than 40,000 chemicals that have been introduced into the planet. And this is as a result of the process of manufacturing and building our modern lifestyles. And I don't want to make it sound like it's all terrible, because it's not. We live in an environment in a current time where we can do almost anything, but it's the collateral damage of the pressure that it's put on our bodies has generated this major issue from a physiologic perspective. If you think about how our body was designed, what was it designed to actually detox? The human detoxification pathways were designed to detox us, the individual, from our internal environment. Because if we had an external environment that didn't have environmental or chemical pollutants, we would be detoxifying anything that circulated from our guts into our bloodstream, our lymphatic systems. Maybe if we ate something that was contaminated with bacteria, we came across a mild poison in terms of a food, our body would be able to process and detoxify it, and ultimately we find our way back to health again. Now the issue is the detoxification system, I think, is getting overburdened because it has to prioritize, actually not that, which are also these things are breaking down as well, but it's got to prioritize the external environment creeping in, the things we breathe, the things we swallow, the things we put on our skin, the things we're exposed to, things like Wi-Fi radiations and stuff of that nature are actually a cornucopia, which is a word I never thought I'd use in a lecture talking about environment, but it's a cornucopia of toxins that is constantly bombarding the system. And the reality is, all of these things are in what we interact with or what we're exposed to on a regular basis. So there's tens of thousands of different products on the market that are for personal care, which have tens of thousands of chemicals in them. There are hazardous chemicals that are found in the food that's for sale. factory farming runoffs, the waste material from the excrement of different animals, that's got to get ushered away from, the plants that are growing on the farm. That finds its way into waterways. More and more man-made EMF frequencies are bombarding our cells. If you could see Wi-Fi, you probably would be terrified if you went outside. It's because you can't see them doesn't mean they're not bouncing around. Every time someone sends a message to you, there's a frequency going from your phone to the, corresponding cell phone tower that's in the area. There's chronically polluted air that surrounds city centers. I mean, China buys air from North America as kind of a novelty thing because air is so clean there and it's so smog filled in certain highly populated cities in certain parts of the world. And then if we add in what I call the pressure cooker of reality, the physical and mental stresses that come from thoughts, feelings, emotions, the things that we consume on television and movies, is it really a wonder why we as a society are getting progressively more sick? I do feel that there's a correlated pattern. And that pattern is if you look at the average health, the status of health of the average person walking the planet, that might be a proxy for the current state of health of the planet itself. Because what we've been doing to this planet since the Industrial Revolution is we've been challenging its ability to find its own homeostasis, or rather maintain its own homeostasis. And it might just be that if we as individuals focus on improving our health personally, becoming more environmentally and consciously aware of what we do to the environment, there's a synergy effect to where one helps the other on an automatic basis. It's just a theory, but I think it's a nice thing. And there's an old saying that says you cannot heal in the same environment in which you got sick. So when it comes to understanding environments, it's really important to delineate in an internal context. That is a very true thing, but I think in an external context, it's even more powerful because you can only control so much internally at one time. When it comes to our influence over the external aspects of our environment, this is why I say there's a supercharged effect when we focus on these things and we give them more love and more attention and more emotion, is because if you're trying to heal something internally, when you do your best to optimize the external, it really does help carry that momentum forwards. So if we look at the internal environment, there really are three areas that I think clinically and as a health professional, we all need to focus on. The one that most people come to us for is the physical environment. They have some dysfunction at an organ cellular level, and they want us to help them find a way out of crisis or out of disease. But there's also the mental and the emotional side, which we've spoken about at length in this series. And I think it's really important that we have to understand that all of these exist in a very interrelating manner. And this ultimately affects us as the organism. We've talked about if someone has, a problem with toxins in their physical body, well, do they have a toxic thought or toxic emotion problem? If someone has a physical issue and they have an unhealthy relationship with something like exercise or the inability to relax and take a day off, well, those physical issues are going to be compounded by the behavioral tactics in which they're conducting themselves. So, an example of this on a phase one level of connecting the dots physically is understanding how possibly poor digestion could contribute to the development of leaky gut, which we've talked about for the last couple of years is a very strong link between if you don't digest your food properly, the downstream consequences to the microbiome, the immune system, and the epithelial lining likely are going to develop a leakiness in that gut at some point, which is going to then place additional burdens on the liver. Why? Because things from your gut are leaking into your circulatory systems, which are going to cause the need to upregulate the detoxification pathways in your liver because the increased amount of endotoxin and undigested food compounds and the cytokines floating around in your bloodstream as a result of your body freaking out are going to stress the body. However, if we take that a layer deeper and connect the physical with the mental and the emotional when it comes to the internal environment, we can then understand how our stress demanding lifestyle or jobs and the collateral mental and emotional stresses will drive changes in vagal tone, which is the most important nerve in the autonomic nervous system that stimulates the release of hydrochloric acid in the stomach, the release of enzymes, bile, and bicarbonate from the gallbladder and the pancreas. And ultimately, these hyposecretive digestive organs are going to be the thing that causes dysfunctional digestion, which results in the development of leaky gut as a downstream consequence. So this is understanding this interconnectedness in the internal environment. When one thing is off, all things are going to be off. And we as practitioners in a holistic, natural way are trying to find this balance and this harmony within the body so the body can heal itself. And it comes back to this, right? It's these understandings that we move in hierarchies of complexity. We're nothing really technically more than atoms that come together in various ways to make molecules, which then form into various cells. And those cells gather together in specialized tissues. Those tissues become an organ, and the organ becomes the organ system, which I believe is the level at which most of us as practitioners see people at when they have experienced enough in terms of symptom development to make them become aware of something isn't right. So at this level, the system level, the dysfunction in the one becomes a compromise of the all. Because if we have gut problems, as we just looked in our example, we create systemic problems as a result of our gut problems. And then it's us, the organism. But how it dovetails into the connection with environment is after the organism, the next progression is a population, which is essentially two people. And then the next progression after the population is the community. And then from the community, it goes to the planet. And this is why I say I have this hypothesis that, the state of the health of the individual reflects the state of health of the planet, because it's all interconnected in terms of its organized hierarchy of structures. It goes from simple to increasingly complex, but one affects all. So I think when it comes to understanding environment and the internal environment, this is what we become really good at when it comes to being clinicians for our people. We have to figure out where the dysfunction is and create the appropriate intervention plan to help this person get back to health, where all of these systems are seamlessly integrated, including the external environmental ones. And it even has its own field of study. It's called exposomics. So, the exposome is a fancy way of saying the sum of the total external environmental factors, xenobiotics, endocrine disruptors, compounds and personal care products, as I mentioned before, immune modulating compounds. All of these compounds are being bombarded in our system, and this chronic exposure really determines how it affects the internal environment. Someone who experiences radiation poisoning is going to have a very different effect internally than someone who has chronic exposure to infections, or, something like Tylenol overuse and its ability to cause gut and liver degradation. We have to understand the context of the exposome as it affects the internal environment, but we also have to understand that there's certain things that we can do to reduce the toxicity of the exposome that comes in from our external environment. Because fundamentally, it is based upon what the planet gives us. It's water, it's air, it's land or earth. And under that category, you can put things like soil and the land which our food is grown on, and ultimately frequency, because frequency is one of the largest areas of change that has happened over the last 100 years in terms of the generation of radio emitting devices and frequencies. So all of these create the external world, which via its interaction influences how we relate with that external world, and thus influences our internal world. So an example would be, the high airborne pollution in city centers, that us breathing in that air is basically taking in that airborne pollution directly into our bloodstream and our general circulation. And if you remember back when we did the deep dive on the respiratory system, what goes into the arteries via the gas exchange in the lungs ultimately finds its way to cells. And if our body is unable to protect us from those things via detoxification, compounds such as that and additional compounds can get embedded in the body. And typically the body's strategy is to store them in tissues where the chemicals are less harmful. That's why body fat is such a fail-safe for people. And when someone starts a weight loss endeavor, it's likely a wise idea to support the detoxification pathways that they have a lot of weight to lose. Additionally, another way of looking at it is from an external environmental perspective, depleted mineral content in our soil, but also chemical residues from commercial farming have a two-way effect. They both take away the necessary nutrition to detoxify, because if you remember some of your phase 2 liver detoxification cofactors, a lot of those are vitamin and mineral and amino acid dependent. So if we're short on nutrition, but we're adding toxic burden via the pesticide residues, which settle in the soil and then get into the food, and those chemical residues get into the body, I mean, the Great Plains Lab runs a glyphosate test for people, and there's a highly correlative aspect of glyphosate load with things like autism spectrum disorder and various neurological disorders. So we can't really separate the internal and the external. I think fundamentally, from a theoretical perspective, we have to see how these things are connected. Because if we carry that, food example forwards, not only are we layering in dysfunctional digestion, but we're layering in food that has an additional negative effect in terms of how it's going to negatively affect our microbiome and thus predispose us to having leaky gut and food translocation into our bloodstream that's not completely digested. So when it comes to environmental fitness in the external environment, this is what's happening in modern lifestyle. If someone has to be sequestered away from the chemicals they're using to rid their field of pesticides, and that same chemical compound is illegal in certain countries, that's a little bit of a red flag to me. If our land is barren and the soil is depleted, there's no food that grows in depleted soil because our vitamins and minerals come from the soil. Specifically, minerals come from the soil, and vitamins as a result of that plant being able to pull nutrition from the soil. And the microbiome of the soil is very much like the one inside of our guts, that it needs time to be able to regenerate and the optimal conditions to do so. And most people in the world live in busy city centers. So what they're breathing is horrible, but it's even worse to say that that air technically is still cleaner than the air inside of the home where people spend 80 to 90% of their time nowadays. So if we don't understand that currently the environment of the world is not set up to support our health, we have to be more vigilant about how we maintain our health internally, but also understand that there are things that we can do strategically to help offset the current state of affairs. So it really is a two-way relationship, as I said. The more we go towards convenience and things driven by technology, the further we get away from the planet. We have to understand that the ecosystem is, contributed to by us, but it also contains us. And humans do live more out of harmony with this environment than any other animal on the planet. And I don't want to get too far down a political rant, but the more we can understand that simple choices can be the initiation of generating a very powerful momentum that turns the tides, I believe we're coming to a point in our reality where we're going to be faced with having to make this decision for the future of different generations on this planet. So ultimately, your environment is a very complex set of circumstances that interact with each other. There's the physical, the chemical, and the biotic aspects, the climate, soil, all the living things. But there's also the physical, the chemical, and the emotional aspects of our environments that play into our personal experience. And the word that I think it really comes back to is the concept of adaptability. We've talked about this many times. The greater your adaptability and the greater that you place importance on staying healthy within an environment largely determines what happens with your health. So the greater the level of adaptability, the more someone can deal with a less optimal environment because their physiology has a greater bandwidth of response and tolerance. But fundamentally, if someone is highly, highly affected by their external environment, well, that's a sign that the environment they're living in is maybe not optimal, but their system is starting to be overburdened or overrun by the chronic stresses of their environment. What that would show up as is, someone being highly affected by chemical sensitivities and the smells of personal care products like body sprays, colognes, and perfumes. Or if someone has highly, highly reactive seasonal allergies, that's a sign that certain branches of the immune system are at a state where they're highly reactive and not tolerant of things like airborne pollens. Anyone who's ever worked with a Lyme population, you realize that these people express some very interesting environmental sensitivities, and Wi-Fi sensitivity is one of them, where they get a headache if they're in a room with a router, for example, or if they have sleep issues, if they haven't created a little Faraday cage for themselves. But even something as simple as gut issues related to food sensitivities can be an insight that the external environment is driving changes in the internal environment. And if anyone's ever listened to Dr. Stephanie Seneff talk about how glyphosate disrupts the shikimate pathway in bacteria, you'll basically understand why glyphosate really is a toxic thing for humans just by the mere eating of a food that has been soaked in glyphosate. And then there's the chronic epidemic of sleep reduction, which we talked about in sleep fitness, due to the fact that we use artificial lights and in many ways, very high efficiency, but physically harming lights that are extending our daylight hours and are compromising our ability to get restful sleep because of our lack of melatonin production. So I think the key understanding in this relationship is the more that things affect someone, it's likely to assume that the less conducive their environment is to their health, which is why if you want to help to get them back on the path, the only way to do that is by focusing energy and effort on the environmental aspect of your holistic treatment plan. Because there is also the other aspect of it to talk about, which there is a fine line between optimization and neurosis. So for all of us to be optimal, and this is just a manifestation of modern lifestyle, we would go back to the Paleolithic hunter-gatherer days, live in small communities. No one would know what a cell phone was. We would be able to drink water from your local stream, and we'd find or hunt all of our food. Some people try to do this by creating little communes or the regenerative agriculture movement, which I think is wonderful, but it's just not possible for almost 9 billion people to do. So the whole thing is understanding what can we control and what can we influence. And if we're talking to a client who's never heard of all of this before, where are they comfortable to start so it's not overwhelming, so you don't develop a stress-based neuroses of them trying to be perfect all the time. And when I work with people, I separate it into these following categories. I can influence the water they drink and the water that they bathe themselves with. Obviously, all of us are going to influence food to some degree. We can influence air in a multitude of different ways. Home lighting, I think, is a massive low-hanging fruit. House care items. So here's where I would put kind of clothing you buy, furniture, bedding, pillows, personal care products. Most people use highly toxic personal care products every day, not realizing that the skin is the largest organ in the body. And when you put things on your skin, you're putting them into your system because they're getting absorbed. And then there's household cleaners. Most people want that Pine-Sol clean smell. They don't realize that a lot of those petro-derived chemicals, while they do clean and they do kill bacteria, they cause a lot of unwanted damage in other ways. And something as simple as concentrated vinegar and water will do almost the same job with absolutely no toxic byproduct. And then there's the conversation about the non-physical items. And these consumption items have to do with what you consume through TV, what your thoughts are, the kind of music you listen to. So if we examine these things on a deeper level, and then we figure out how to create a framework and a strategy to communicate to our clients the why of the importance, it's an easy thing to make a very progressive development in their plan in order to understand the hierarchy of what's most important. I think starting with food is the most important because everyone has to eat, and it fits very nicely in with a context and concept of someone making a mental shift in order from adding a supplement routine to a very specific style of diet that relates with their potentially current condition. And as I mentioned before, the real reason for going organic is really as a result of what is not allowed on organic food. So glyphosate and its internal havoc on the microbiome, as a digestive wellness company, we cannot leave that alone because if you reduce the toxic burden, the ability to benefit from supporting the digestive system becomes even more powerful. But there are other toxic compounds in our foods, toxic fats and oils, anything that's in a plastic bottle that's on a shelf, whether it be vegetable oil, canola oil, sunflower, safflower oil. These four foodborne toxins, in addition to things that come in the preserved food categories, artificial colors, sweeteners, and preservatives, easy thing to get out first and foremost with people because when they reduce the quantity of fast food and toxic food they eat, they immediately reduce the toxic burden on the system. And then if you want to go a step further, things like cookware and plastics, using Teflon coated frying pans is really convenient to not clean something up. But that Teflon coating eventually comes off of the pan and it goes in the food that we eat. So understanding that is an easy way to convince someone not to eat that. And then storing food in plastics, heating plastics in a microwave, drinking water in plastic, the compounds in the plastic eventually leach into the food. So even though someone may be doing the due diligence by eating, a diet that looks like the top right corner, if they're storing that food in their plastic and they're reheating it in the plastic, they're taking away from the potential benefit. And adding an additional hypothesis as it relates to the external environment, eating produce, this is a hypothesis of mine, eating produce grown in sick soil is transferring the illness of the soil to our microbiome. And I'm seeing this nowadays to where Certain people are trying to increase food diversity and trying to include all of these strategies that they've been told are very beneficial from a fiber and food rotation. But the reality of the situation is it's causing them a lot of gastric distress. So a lot of these high carb foods and these, excessive supplemental fibers that are finding their way into the health food industry, things like inulin and chicory root, I think are actually messing with the colonic microbiome. And then add that to inadequate digestion. It's like the match that's necessary to be struck to burn the gasoline that's present. So the fundamental reality is, in order for us to be able to eat a diverse, healthy organic diet, we need to make sure that our digestive health and our microbiomes are up to the task of tolerating all of these things. So when it comes to the fundamental long and short of it, there's an old saying that I teach all my clients, eat real food, a good quantity of plants. That's it. That's from the book The Omnivore's Dilemma by no, not Doctor, by Michael Pollan. And then to piggyback food, water is one of the most important things, if not the most important thing we put in our body besides oxygen. And if you actually check what a municipal water supply allows in our water, the actual contents are disgusting. They just justify it with having a very, very small part per million dose for a certain amount. But things like fluoride, fluorine, which are there to actually neutralize whatever microbes may be living in the water. But we have to understand that in many cases, the water that we flush into our toilets goes out into the municipal areas where we actually derive our drinking and bathing water from. So we're talking things like medication residues, hormonal residues, and industrial farming runoffs. In addition to that, most people drink plastic water bottles, which we just talked about. So the fundamental long and short of it is we need to find a way to get better water. And there are a multitude of different ways, and we have to be sensitive to what someone's ready for. Whatever level of filtration they're ready for, I support. If that's a countertop Brita charcoal filter, that's a great starting point. Ultimately, the best source of filtration comes from a reverse osmosis, which takes everything out of the water. We do need to understand, though, that that water, although is pure, becomes dead water. There's no mineral content left. So if someone is using a reverse osmosis system, doing something to remineralize the water after the fact is a really good strategy. Additionally, an alternative route is using a high quality spring water delivery service. And you can get these where they deliver it in glass, so you're getting rid of the plastic. And all of the household water bottles, if someone wants to fill water to prevent them from buying something out, buy something that's a high quality glass, ceramic, or stainless steel. And the last area when it comes to looking at water is the water you bathe in. So the water that comes into your bathtub or comes into your shower is the same one that you would essentially drink. So your skin microbiome is always being exposed to the chlorine, to the fluoride. So something as simple as a high quality shower or bath filter can really help on the waterfront to remediate some of the stresses that come from poor environmental fitness in our water. Air is another one, and maybe we may be thinking, well, I change my HVAC filter on a regular basis. With the quantity of time we spend in our home, knowing that there's 2 to 5 times more airborne pollutants inside the house than outside the house, even though we can't see them or smell them, they're still there because ultimately modern houses are built to be very much sealed off from the external environment. And in addition, if you live in a hot environment like I do, my air conditioning is running chronically. So the worry is AC condensation buildup. And anytime there's water buildup, there's the potential for mold to start to grow. So the simple concept is if you filter the air in your house, your lungs don't have to as much. And what I try to do is the rooms I spend the most time in, there's one actually right next to me. I use a HEPA filter, air filter, generally speaking, and I size it appropriately to the room. And because I do a lot of work with athletes, the ability for their lungs to exchange oxygen is kind of important in my world as it is in theirs. So what I always do is I try to get them set up with a HEPA filter in the bedroom, in the room they spend the most time in, socially in the room they spend the most time in doing any kind of work. And there are multiple good brands out there. Air Doctor is one, for example. And the other thing that you can do is upgrade the quality of your HVAC filter. When someone buys a new built house, they rely upon the builder to supply all the starting materials. You have to understand, builders are out to make money. So they typically, unless you specify upgrades, buy the lowest quality filter that's allowed by code. So if you upgrade the quality of your HVAC in addition to add a HEPA filter, you'd be shocked at what your filters look like after 6 months. And the fact that they're in the filter means that they're less likely to go into your lungs and into your body. And something as simple as opening the windows and doors once a day for 15 to 30 minutes will also help some of the fresh air come in and some of the stale air move out of the system. Lights I could go on for forever just because I find the methodology by which lights affect our health is just fascinating. We talked about the concept of circadian rhythm and that our body uses the light frequency coming from the sun to understand what time of day it is so it can control the release of things like hormones to stimulate increases and decreases in energy, to upregulate digestive processes. Basically, everything is very much light dependent. That being said, lighting can be an expensive thing, which is why the rise of high efficiency energy light bulbs have become something that have been very popular in the last little while. And the reason these things work is because they take out all the inefficient energy. If you touch what's called a cool white LED, you will never burn yourself. The same technology is used in the TV screen, the same technology is used on a computer, on a cell phone. And the reason these technologies are good from a power perspective is they get rid of the inefficient, wasteful energy that creates heat. That being said, what ends up happening to your physiology if it's exposed to these cool LEDs in the evening after the sun goes down is this light spectrum emittance is incomplete. It's very biased. So we're getting the light energy concentrated that the sun would put out in the middle of the day, which ultimately tells our bodies to be more upregulated in terms of energy levels. It makes cortisol release. It suppresses the production of melatonin. And if we're doing that in the evening after the sun goes down, it very greatly disrupts our sleep quality. In addition, lights can be a source of toxic exposure themselves, especially if you live or work in an area that has fluorescent lights. You know, those old school long cylindrical lights that are placed in those cheap looking plastic covers that you had in elementary or high school. There's a mercury filament in those things. So if you're chronically under those lights, not only are you getting a very incomplete experience of light, because the body does need full spectrum light in order to create things like vitamin D, but you're biasing your circadian rhythm and you're potentially exposing yourself to hazardous compounds. So the solution here, if possible, is to look for a solution that is both energy efficient but appropriate for the circadian rhythm by not using high-powered lights when the sun's gone down. Things like red bulbs or specialized bulbs like a warm white LED that has the blue removed from them, or using something like an incandescent Edison bulb, which operate at a much lower wattage. So it doesn't use as much energy, but it ultimately helps to create a more optimal environment. And then there's things like home items. And here's what we call, the VOC crowd. So furniture, mattresses, pillows, carpets, rugs. A lot of these things to be legally able to be sold have to be doused in flame retardants or various compounds so that they don't become fire hazards. And a lot of these compounds or the materials that are used to create them end up becoming endocrine disruptors and neurotoxins that off gas in the home. And we just talked about air quality. If the home doesn't have a good filtration system, that poor indoor air quality is going to be adding to the degree of chemical exposure of the body. And why this is important is for people who have very sensitive immune systems, Lyme patients, autoimmune patients, cancer patients. You don't want them to be on some kind of protocol or plan where they're doing something that's trying to offset the stress and stimulate the immune system, then going back to an environment that is being highly contributing or contributory to the toxic burden that their body then needs to deal with. So understanding home items, which in my world kind of piggyback into personal care products, these are so easy to address just based upon understanding the difference between a commercial grade product and something that's more health oriented or potentially biased towards being a clean product. Most people don't know this, that the largest purchaser of carbon credits in the world is the makeup industry. And what carbon credits are essentially they are a tax to allow you to pay a small fine to pollute more. And I remember when I was in nutrition school, there was a book called There's Lead in Your Lipstick that was one of my required readings for the environment class. And in that book, it let you know that The average woman eats 32 tubes of lipstick per year, which all contain lead. There's still lead allowed to be used in the production of lipstick. And things like foundation and eyeliner contain some of the highest concentrations of bisphenol A of any product out there. So there are on an average 518 chemicals in the personal care products that we use on a regular basis in the Western world, and 125 of them are suspected carcinogens. Again, anything you put on your body goes into your body. Anything that goes into your body has to be dealt with by the body. So this is where I go through all the different things with my clients: shampoos, conditioners, deodorants, soaps, face washes. If you're using it for oral hygiene or personal hygiene, it's worth looking at. Because again, when you reduce the toxic burden, it gives the body the ability to not have to necessitate being so good on the opposite end when it comes to detoxification. Household cleaners are the same thing. Things like all-purpose cleaners, polishes, toilet bowl cleaners, dishwashing soap and detergents, fabric softeners. Those are a few of the common compounds that are in them. And again, it's not a one-time massive dose exposure kind of thing. It's not an acute toxic exposure. It's dripping in little bits of poison over time that really compounds things. And when someone loses their adaptability, this may be the difference between pushing them over the edge or not, depending upon the kind of symptoms they're presenting. So that's why I say, these environmental suggestions that we typically give to people at the end of the session, or, as a little adjunct thing at the end of their protocol, it's like, oh, do this and do that. In some cases, I start with this now because if I can get these things under control, I know that if I add 2% here, 5% there, 10% there, I've created a great momentum in the general direction of them getting healthier. And there's the environmental aspect of the non-physical stuff. Social media, news media, how much time we spend on our phones. In many ways, these can be toxins that you take in, especially if someone has an unhealthy relationship with this stuff. In addition to the fact that using these things always allows us to be exposed to man-made high-frequency electromagnetic radiation. And if you look at some of the research on this, there's a really good book called Going Somewhere. I don't remember who wrote it, but it was a lawyer who was essentially taking some of the cell phone companies to court on some of the research that was buried on the damaging effects of Wi-Fi radiation. What it typically does is it impacts the amount of oxidative stress the body experiences, which upregulates free radical stress. And that free radical stress compromises the health of a cell, downregulates mitochondrial function, and generates increased levels of inflammation. And if we're looking at what the environment is doing to humans nowadays, infertility rates have never been higher, sperm counts have never been lower. They keep readjusting normal for male testosterone levels because what used to be normal is now extremely high, and what used to be low is trying to be marketed as a new normal. And we have to understand that if we have smart home monitoring and smart home everything, every device that is connected via Bluetooth, via Wi-Fi, is blanketing your internal environment with a hazardous, potentially hazardous frequency. And it's not necessarily us as adults that are the ones that are as susceptible. It's kids. And I don't know if a lot of people know this, but the reason you can't rent a car until you're 25 is due to men. And men's brains do not myelinate until they're 25 fully, which means that our level of maturity finally, and that's even debatable on some days, finally arrives at the age of 25. Why that's important in this example is because myelination is essentially the protective covering over nerves that induce the proper ability for that nerve to be protected, but also to induce the communication, because the communication jumps between the gaps in the myelin sheath. If a brain and a nervous system is not myelinated, it doesn't have that covering, and therefore it's more susceptible to hazardous frequencies. And it's why kids shouldn't be allowed to sit on their iPad resting on their lap for 3 or 4 hours a day, because without the necessary off time, the child is absorbing a high amount of electromagnetic radiation. So something simple as grounding, getting in touch with the Earth's natural resonance. The Earth has a pulse, and it's called the Schumann resonance. And the Schumann resonance, interestingly enough, from the research I've read, is the same frequency of resonance that a healthy human should have. A human cell should be at 70 to 90 millivolts of electricity. That's the magnitude of output of a healthy cell. And it's interesting that a cancer cell operates at about 10 to 20 millivolts of electricity. So we are electrical beings, and we're living in an environment that is not necessarily conducive to us maintaining that, because our inability to connect with the earth, coupled with our chronic exposure to disturbing frequencies, is actually reducing not only the charge in our bodies, it's disrupting the communication within our bodies. So it really comes down to understanding, yes, our lives are important in the dreams that we're chasing and the things we want to do for ourselves, but we're one in a part of a much bigger community. And this whole concept of the ecosystem, I think, is going to be a challenge of the next 25 to 50 years, because we're going to have to hopefully harness our ability to understand technology to bring ourselves back to a way of finding harmony with our external environment and hopefully our internal environments. Because before industrial revolution, there was a very simple and cohesive system. Humans interacted with our environment as a part of our environment, not better than it. And it was our environment that provided what it is we need to keep us healthy. If you look at modern industry, we have segmented these things. We're so far removed from the food that we eat nowadays. I remember an example of someone who I was mentoring under one time. He told me the story of asking his nephew, where does beef come from? And his nephew answered at the age of 7, the grocery store. So that concept or that example alone lets us know that, we don't really understand how this ecosystem is meant to interact, and how we store food, how we have divorced ourselves from our external environment, how we've stressed our environment from a soil perspective, and our just need for more and more because of an increasing population. Our external environment is really not set up to do what it's been doing for very much longer. And if we actually look at what most people are afraid of in the concept of the germ being the problem, this gentleman is the reason why we have the concept of pasteurization. Louis Pasteur is the guy who was kind of, the gentleman purporting the germ theory of disease. On his deathbed, he uttered this, and Bernard was right: the germ is nothing, the terrain is everything. And the same pattern is really reflected in the microbiome. So we understand when someone has an overgrowth of a certain species, they have an infection of another species, it's never that single microbe or that single strain that was the problem. It was how that strain is able to interact with the rest of the terrain of the environment and ultimately overrun it and manifest itself as a sort of infection or a disease state. Because the patterns are very similar. What goes on in the body and the dynamic of how the body, the microbiome, the individual as a host microbiome interaction play out is very similar to what happens in nature. And it comes back to what I said before. I think by us eating food grown in the sick soil, we're bringing in the frequency and the patterns of sickness into our own bodies. If we understand this, the patterns that will bring us back to health personally are the same patterns that will bring, the health of the soil back. So keeping these two systems running really well is a big part of this strategy. And phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification is something we learned in school, and we just assume it works really well. We have to understand that we can run the phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification processes really well with the appropriate nutrients, the appropriate supplements. But if we can reduce the amount of toxic burden coming in, we can then reduce the reliance upon making sure this process is running really well. And in addition to that, if someone is going through some sort of detoxification process, it doesn't end there. The digestive system is the start of it, and the digestive system is the end of it. You need a binder. You need to make sure someone's, vacating the bowels on a regular basis. You need to make sure someone is very well hydrated, rather, to make sure this process is running as seamlessly as possible. And that allows us to dovetail into some of the products that I want to cover today. We don't have anything that is a true deep detox product. A while back, we did a video called Detox versus Cleansing. And I would say that we have incredibly good products for light cleansing and products that fit into a bigger picture detoxification program really, really well. The first one I'll talk about is chlorozine. And I think chlorella is probably one of the best overall supplements you can take for a multitude of reasons. It in and of itself will induce some form of upregulated detoxification via the fact that it's a natural binder of certain things. It seems to have an affinity for things like heavy metals, but it also lends a lot of antioxidant power to the process of detoxification and cleansing. Because in the process of detoxification, every time the body neutralizes a compound, it makes a free radical. So its antioxidant and binding capacity, in addition to its nutritional density, you'll find complete amino acids, you'll find high quantities of vitamins and minerals, and chlorozyme seems to be a really good thing for high quantities of radiation exposure. I was in school when the Fukushima power plant in Japan erupted, and one of the things that I remember being taught was that using things like chlorella and spirulina were top priority when it comes to helping offset the damages of radiation exposure. So chlorella, even in and of itself, when not being used as a cleansing product, can be used as a regular maintenance product due to all the benefits that it provides into us. And it can be part of a bigger picture detox program for its ability to help bind and vacate things that the body wants to get out of the system via having a bowel movement. Cleanzyme is another one that works really well as a bowel motility agent because it actually has a strong active binder in it. I know we talk about cleanzyme being very beneficial because it has enzymes that dissolve biofilms. It has, oxygenated magnesium, which induces a cleansing effect because it attracts water into the bowel and helps cleanse the system. But if you look on the ingredients, it also has bentonite clay, which is a very powerful binder of toxins. If someone is doing any kind of deep cleansing or detox process, especially when the gut's concerned, having some sort of binder is a really good thing to make sure that those compounds are getting out of the system, being bound, and being vacated in stool when someone has a bowel movement. But cleanzyme in and of itself is also really good because biofilms tend to hide things. So when you're disrupting biofilms and you can use something like magnesium oxide, that's when you can actually cleanse out different aggregations of fungal overgrowths, certain kinds of microbes or parasites. And because it's a motility promoter, making sure the bowels are moving on a regular basis is one of the best things that we can do when it comes to making sure we keep the inside of our bodies clean. Cleanzyme can be something that's taken in high doses for a short period of time to do an intensive cleanse. And for some people, they take one or two cleanzyme daily on a regular basis, just as a way to promote overall bowel health and motility, especially for people who seem to have struggles when they default to constipation. And the other aspect of looking at environmental fitness is using, call them environmental supplements. So things that help to mitigate EMF, things that help to mitigate harmful light frequencies in the evening, and things that you can actually put on your body to help keep the body in harmony when it's exposed to chronic levels of EMF. I mean, if anyone's watching this living in a condo building or even a subdivision, pull up your phone after the lecture's done and see how many Wi-Fi routers you can pick up to connect to. And each Wi-Fi router is blasting out a signal. And oftentimes these new Wi-Fi routers are blasting out 5G internet, which is incredibly powerful and has a much greater surface area that it reaches in terms of its frequency distribution. So, using some of these Hedron products that we have access to, I think is part of what I would call strategic lifestyle mitigation nowadays because you can't hide from these things. Our lives are so integrated with our phones, integrated with our internal environment. If you can mitigate the emittance from your phone when you sleep by using something like a sleeve, it's an awesome optimal idea. I think anyone using one of the Hedron glasses, which have a very special lens that takes in high frequency and essentially uh, alters the frequency so the blue spectrum, the dominant blue spectrum, isn't being received by the eye. What's happening is, if you remember using a color palette in elementary school, when you mix different colors together, you can make a new color. Well, the opposite is true. If high blue energy comes in and hits a red light, it becomes more of a yellow-green frequency, which are not nearly as energy dense or as energy disrupting. And this can be a way where you can watch TV in the evening, possibly do some work on your laptop or be on your phone, but the light emitting from your devices is not going to be received by the eye and ultimately compromise your body's ability to become tired, make enough melatonin so you get restful and recovered sleep. And I think that's everything, guys. Almost to the minute. So, you know, all in all, I hope that that information resonated with everyone. The fundamental long and short of it is Yes, we are clinical practitioners. Yes, we deal with the various challenges and develop strategies for our clients to find their way out of these health challenges. But if we're holistic practitioners, holistic is more than just a supplement plan. A supplement plan is part of the bigger picture. And ultimately, if we can help someone create an optimal environment in a holistic way, both internally and externally, we can help that person get back to and sustain health. And I think, maybe wishful thinking, start shifting people's perspectives and understanding the importance of thinking more globally when it comes to the external environment.